Welcome to my talk today. My topic I've entitled it Decolonizing Parapsychology. This is a presentation given for the SSE PA Connections Convention in 2021, combined online convention of the Parapsychological Association and the Society for Scientific Exploration. You can see in the bottom right here my contact information for any questions or comments that you would like to send my way, my email address. And of course, for any additional interest in my research program, you can look at my academia page here and see some of my published works. My name is Jacob W. Glazier. I have my PhD in Consciousness and Society Psychology from the University of West Georgia. I'm currently also a limited term full-time instructor, professor at the University of West Georgia, where I teach courses ranging from Introduction to Psychology, Abnormal Psychology, Introduction to Psychotherapy, Psychology in Mind and Body, and so on and so forth. So what I hope to do today is to examine parapsychology through the lens of what's called post-colonial studies or decolonialism. And essentially, post-colonial studies is considered a strand of critical theory or critical thought that has its roots in several different places, but perhaps most notably in Friedrich Nietzsche, some of the phenomenologists, even existentialism, psychoanalysis. So building on Freud's field of psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan famously brought in structural linguistics to look at the way that we can understand human desire, human motivation, and human beings in general through language. And so figures like Lacan, figures like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, who famously inaugurated the project of deconstruction, and Deleuze and Guattari, many other thinkers that I'm unfortunately leaving out, have helped bring about what Ian Parker has called critical psychology. Critical psychology is an approach to psychology that, of course, is adjacent to parapsychology in some ways, not similar in all ways, but nonetheless, it's an approach to psychology that examines the way that power functions institutionally and the way that we can see how different identities, different subjectivities create certain kinds of knowledge practices. And so what I'm hoping to do today is to bring some of the ideas and concepts from critical psychology into dialogue with parapsychology. And again, more specifically, looking at the process of decolonizing. Decolonizing the kind of implicit ideologies or assumptions that the field may not recognize in an overt fashion. So what is post-colonial studies? Dussel gives us a brief definition in that it's a branch of academic study that critically examines the continued exploitation and subjugation of colonized groups. So again, to be more specific with regards to these implicit assumptions that may lie unconscious, subconscious, or implicit, these values include the privileging of the continent of Europe and the kind of methods, practices, and approaches that started on that continent and then now have been exported around the globe through processes like globalization, white supremacy. So how is it that the privileging of certain ethnicity at the expense of others, how does that influence research? How does that influence knowledge? Androcentrism, which is male-centeredness. So how is it that the tradition, the historical trajectory stemming from the Enlightenment, even before the Enlightenment, has favored a certain male-centered view of the world? And how does that factor into our current understanding of the paranormal and psi? The heteronormativity, so a certain kind of cisgender straight view of the world that has predominated through the last century and beyond, how does that also impact our ability to kind of objectively identify truth in research? Postcolonial studies was inaugurated by thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and Gayatri Spivak. Of course, the central tenet is to critically examine the ways that colonizers pillage and install new material practices and values in the conquered community. So Tuck and Yang give us a more advanced or developed definition in the decolonial studies, when most centered in indigenous philosophy, push back against assumptions about the linearity of history in the future. These again are certain Enlightenment notions stemming from the 1600s and 1700s, the kind of view of the progress of science to cure humanity of its suffering, the belief in technological progression. And we can see that, as they go on to say here, this is a view against teleological narratives, so against those very narratives that I just mentioned. And rather, a decolonial perspective argues for renderings of time and place that exceed coloniality and conquest. So we can take just briefly the example of the belief in technological progression. And we can juxtapose that to the current state of ecology today, and we can see where that's gotten us. And it's a kind of abhorrent ethical relation that we have to nature, that we have to the environment, that we remain blind to through the example of single-use plastics or factory farming. So we want to look at ways that we can kind of dismantle or deconstruct these values that we just take for granted in our consumerist behavior, of course, but more importantly, in our research practice as scientists. And of course, post-colonial studies or decolonialism is in line with a century of critique that's aimed at these kinds of Enlightenment values and methods. This is against a kind of orthodox or legendary scientific approach that may stem from positivism in the early 1900s that tries to get at this kind of objective, unbiased, impartial view of truth. And that positivism is rooted in a natural science approach. And so we'll see here as I move on to the next slide, certain key concepts that we might be able to, as parapsychologists or as researchers and scientists, we can use to help decolonize our own approach. So ideology, we want to be critical of ideologies in the spirit of recognizing these implicit assumptions. Althusser famously called these ideological state apparatuses or a totality. Gramsci talked about these in terms of a hegemony, or these kinds of monolithic epistemological structures that crowd out other ways of existing in the world. As a researcher, I want to engage in understanding my own positionality. Positionality is how our beliefs and values influence our relationship with the world, with research, and with others. Kimberly Crenshaw famously developed the notion of intersectionality in legal studies to talk about the dynamic way that social roles such as class, race, and gender interact, creating advantage or disadvantage. So as a researcher, we can be explicit about our intersectionality. How is it that my race, for example, my gender, how does that impact, how does that allow me a certain advantage in my research practices? How does that give me a leg up? Or how does it disadvantage me? Reflexivity, this is perhaps most pointedly aimed at research practices. And this is a process whereby, as a researcher, we need to assess our stakes in the knowledge being produced. So why am I interested in this, this kind of research, this line of research? Why am I drawn to it? What are my stakes? What are my motivations? Being transparent about that, being clear about that, not just in casual or professional conversations, but in academic articles, in the discussion section, perhaps, making those things explicit to the reader. And then finally, the very process of decolonization, which is, Fanon tells us, is to systematically dismantle colonial pathologies that infect institutions, concepts, and practices. So it's a difficult, laborious, long process, but nonetheless, it's on our behest, if we want to be ethical researchers, to engage in a process of decolonization. So what is this? How can we interface this with parapsychology? Ryan and Pratt give us a sense by which early on there was a position to make parapsychology in the vein of the natural sciences. And they write here that it should from the very beginning be made clear that the phenomena with which parapsychology deals are all, without exception, events of nature. So in other words, the field of problems belongs entirely to natural science. And that term natural science, I think, is a fulcrum of sorts in terms of being problematic or troublesome when we try and lift those methods from the natural sciences and apply them to the study of the human being. I think there is a certain category error that happens, or to use the language of decolonial studies, there's a certain kind of colonization that happens of the human being. And so I think we have to be really mindful of that. Of course, parapsychology was concerned with trying to make itself in the mold of the other natural sciences, yet this scientific approach, like I've mentioned, works towards being impartial, unbiased, and objective, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's at the expense of subjectivity, at the expense of the way that we're embedded and contextualized with our objects of study. The inability of the natural sciences to understand the human, of course, I think most famously was already critiqued by the phenomenologist Husserl, among others, arguing that trying to take the methods and approaches of the natural sciences and try to apply them to what we might call consciousness today does a disservice to both the method and to both the object of study. A couple chapters later, in their monograph, Ryan and Pratt delineate the influence of the experimenter effect on psi tests. This emphasizes the subjective element. And so there's a kind of double-edged sword at play in parapsychology that, on the one hand, I think as scientists, we've been very good about recognizing the impact that the researcher has on psi hitting or missing tests, for example, the experimenter effect. But on the other hand, we haven't been so good about analyzing or deconstructing the ways that our values as that very researcher may impact the results of our experiment. Therefore, parapsychology, I argue, rests at a special disciplinary position insofar as I think that it can speak more broadly to the science of the mind, to what psychology tries to study, than can mainstream psychology, and if we update our outmoded methodologies. Summer, this quote here, develops a historiography that looks at the beginning of both psychology and parapsychology as disciplines, and including William James and others. And the author writes that the very vehemence and affectivity of attacks and the thinly veiled academic contempt towards the other of modern psychology or parapsychology suggests that what was and apparently still is at stake is more than merely intellectual disagreements or problems of professionalization. So there's something deeper going on. It's not just fighting over terrain per se, but there's something deeper that's happening. And I would suggest again that applying or monolithically applying rather these kinds of natural methods from science, from the natural sciences to human consciousness, or even more specifically, the study of psi, is in itself a kind of colonization that does a disservice to our research practices. The third bullet point here, Michel Foucault famously argued that the natural research methods come from a scientific tradition that necessarily subjugates indigenous voices in the service of discovering truth. And of course, truth, the meaning of which is predicated on a tradition of misogyny, racism, and Eurocentrism. And this is unequivocal. And what I mean by that is that one has to necessarily look at the historical antecedents and the historical contexts that have gone into the creation of the institutions that we have today. And that history is, again, predicated on these kinds of values, these kinds of perspectives. And so it's on our behest as ethical, not just ethical researchers, but to do good science. Means to disentangle and to dismantle and to disassemble these kinds of hierarchical, homogeneous practices that we may not always be aware are occurring. So I have some rhetorical or non-rhetorical questions that hopefully as scientists, as parapsychologists, we can use to start to reflect on our practice, on our research practice. So how do these kinds of values like misogyny or Eurocentrism, how do they show up in our experiments? How do they show up in our thinking about psi and the paranormal? How do they structure our conceptual ability to engage imaginatively with what psi is? How does parapsychology continue to perpetuate misogyny, sexism, heteronormativity, Eurocentrism? How are these things perpetuated? Perhaps not intentionally, but nonetheless, they continue to exist. Feminist scholars have done a really excellent job of analyzing the way that metaphors, specifically in biology, the immune system, the reproduction system, in science textbooks seem to contain a certain male-centeredness to them. So what kind of metaphors are we using in parapsychology, and how do they shade or color a certain view of the world? How do we use metaphors in parapsychology to talk about or to write about psi? What are those metaphors, and what kind of values might they be conveying? Why might we want to reflect and account for these kinds of attitudes and ways of thinking about the paranormal when we carry out research? So why engage in a process of decolonization? What are our stakes? What is at stake as a field, as a discipline, as a researcher? And then finally, the experimenter effect as just one very small case in point demonstrates the deep connection between researcher and participant. How can this knowledge help parapsychology become a more equitable field? So what kind of work can we do to, of course, we know there's a connection between researcher and participant and paranormality, but how can we disentangle that? How can we deconstruct that? Or put differently, how can we better thickly describe that and talk about it, discourse on it, rather than just leave the value implicit and have it kind of perpetuate itself without our being aware of it? So towards a kind of post-colonial parapsychology, some simple tips, I think, that can help us become better scientists, discuss and include our positionality in formal research or even in professional conversations. So how do you understand your identity in relation to others and in relation to the world? How is your sex give you a certain form of privilege? How does it not? I think engaging in a process of reflexivity. So even in a published article, talking about what are my stakes in the knowledge being produced? Why am I interested in this knowledge? Well, why am I pursuing this line of inquiry? And so on and so forth. recognizing the ways that our intersectionality impacts research, mentorship, and gatekeeping. So for example, how are we fostering misogyny, for example? How are we perpetuating white supremacy? How are we privileging certain Eurocentric values? Reimagining indigenous ways of discovering knowledge and being mindful of cultural and colonial appropriation. So getting outside of a Eurocentric, globalized meta-narrative and really excavating certain kinds of subjugated knowledges, more indigenous knowledges, native methods that can try and teach us about psi, try and teach us about the paranormal, rather than kind of foisting our methods on these kinds of native peoples, native epistemologies, and even native cosmologies. So this figure I developed to help us start to begin the decolonization process. Beginning at the top, I think it's so important for us to increase diversity in our ranks, in professional memberships, researchers, to bring a diverse, multiplicitous group of people together. We, of course, need to critically examine the kinds of ideologies that lie implicit within our certain knowledge practices, within our research. We need to expand our scientific practice, so bringing in more qualitative, anthropological, literary, other kinds of approaches that don't rely on this form of experimentalism. While there's nothing wrong with it, it's a limited view of the world, and it's a very limited view of the human being. And so I think parapsychology needs to broaden its understanding of science and incorporate other multiplicitous approaches. We need to also, I believe, reimagine public acceptance. So for example, rather than engaging with Raber and Alcock in certain professional journals and a certain kind of polemic to try and establish the reputability of parapsychology or the field's legitimacy, I think we can capitalize on the public's imagination with the paranormal and shift the kind of strategy to one that doesn't engage in this kind of never-ending polemic with what is truth in terms of psychology versus parapsychology. We need to embrace alternative indigenous approaches. Again, looking at different ways of engaging and researching and understanding the world and seeing what more native cultures, indigenous peoples can teach us about the paranormal. And then finally, I believe we need to reclaim the concept of the paranormal. And what I mean by that is that rather than see it as a kind of pejorative, anomalous type fringe phenomena, we need to advocate that, as is evidenced not just by the literature and parapsychology, but by anecdotes, by certain myths, by certain stories, by other kinds of anthropological research, that there is an element that is paranormal in nature that has to do with human consciousness and its connection to the world. And as scientists, we don't fully understand that element. And we won't develop a better understanding of that element unless we're willing to be risky with our research and put ourselves out on a limb and try new kinds of methods at looking at the way that paranormality operates culturally and in different societies around the world. I want to leave us with a quote, or rather conclude with a quote from Frantz Fanon. Today's talk, he writes that imperialism or colonization leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well. So it's not just that conceptually, theoretically in our mind, are we infected by the certain remnants of Eurocentrism or Westernism, the way that we see the world, the way that we think about the world, but more fundamentally, in the spirit of decolonizing the discipline, these kinds of germs are in the land. They're in our institutions. They're in our geography. And so our material ways of engaging with the world, the kinds of research we do, the kinds of gatherings, professional gatherings we have, the way we organize ourselves as a discipline, these also contain these kinds of imperialist germs. And so I want to conclude by saying that decolonizing parapsychology, employing the tools of postcolonial studies to better understand the paranormal, I think does positions parapsychology in a place that will allow it to better reflect on its own axioms, on its own assumptions. And not only that, but I think as scientists and as researchers, if we start this slow process of decolonization, I think we'll do better science in the end. And not only will that create a better ethical kind of relation within our discipline, but we'll see and understand new ways in which psi or the paranormal shows up in the world. That's my references for those interested. That's it. Thank you so much.